Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with the pleasure today of talking about the Iran war with three profound experts. Our Canadian friend Robert Joustra at Redeemer University outside Toronto, our own Just War scholar Marc LiVecche, and our own Mideast expert Robert Nicholson. I will begin by addressing our Canadian friend Robert Joustra. You have posted online your skepticism about the Iran war in terms of just war teaching. What are your main points?
So I think my main sort of continuing complaint, I know Mark and I did a bit of a dry run on this a few weeks ago, so we'll see if we've changed our views, isn't about the legality or the constitutionality, which tends to be where a lot of people's concerns sort of center. My concern really is about the focus of the aims of the war itself in terms of right intention, and whether and how you can sort of coherently and concretely imagine a kind of use post bellum kind of framework if it's not entirely clear or if there's enough vagary or ambiguity around the intentions and the aims of the war. When we talked last week, I could think of at least, maybe a little longer ago, I could think of at least four. There were the ballistic missiles, there's the nuclear material, there's the terror network. I could think of a reason for humanitarian intervention, although for various reasons, I think we're talking about that a lot less than we could right now. And now, I think since we've spoken, we would talk definitely of a fifth, which is, of course, the Straits of Hormuz and the energy crisis that's come off the back of that. Any one of those seem not unreasonable objectives to me. I think my concern is that in order to achieve most and certainly all of them, the tactical operations that are currently in focus will not be sufficient to achieve them. And without a clarity in terms of the right intention, it's very difficult to know about use in bello. So, what's proportional, what's militarily necessary. That depends on what the just aim is. It's very difficult to imagine a kind of proximate justice that emerges. So I would be much helped in my just war analysis if more clarity was offered, and that would tell us in terms of our progress. Well, are we closer to victory? We're further away from victory. I mean, what's really happening here? And of course, nobody entirely knows the answer to that question. And I think that puts the whole gambit on pretty rocky foundations.
And Robert and Mark, when you use these Latin just war terms, if you would explain them for our lay audience. Marc LiVecche, your response from a just war perspective, where do you come down on the Iran war?
Yeah, it might land a little differently, maybe than Robert does. I think there are a couple of, and I'm not sure that Robert's doing this, but of late there have been a number of articles that have been written that I think are confusing some of the categories in their analysis and how they go about it. And I think a broad misconstrual is to make a move that says that the war isn't just because the the ambiguity about whether or not there's the probability of succeeding in the intentions of the war. And just very broadly, what I would say here is that a war could be just, even if the probabilities for success are questionable. Uh, in such a case, it wouldn't be a question of justice or justness of the war, but it would be a question of wisdom, whether or not it was wise to do. So to get back to the Latin term, the jus ad bellum, which just means justice toward war, uh, and then here I could reset and say, and look, this is going to depend on who you're asking. But in terms of a classical understanding of the requirements of the jus ad bellum, of when it is right to fight, if you go to Augustine, you go to Thomas Aquinas, you're going to find three primary concerns. One is that you have a proper authority. And here we could get into some question in, a constitutional republic in which there is a balance of powers, who precisely it is that ought to be declaring the war. And so in the case of America, we might have a constitutional or a legal question, but I think it's pretty clear that in classical terms, the authority is he or she or it or they over whom there is nobody greater charged with care of the political community. And only that person can drag the political community into combat. Um, I would say largely we've got a check there, like that works for this particular case. Then the second concern is a just cause. And I think Robert illuminated them. I think Trump in his very first speech on that Saturday, 19 days ago or so, listed them. And I think he listed all five that Robert talked about: the elimination of the drone and ballistic program, the elimination of the nuclear program, or the reduction of these things, right? Sinking the Navy and keeping the commerce on the Strait of Hormuz open, destroying Iran's ability or their will to continue supporting proxy terrorists against Israel and other international neighbors. Um, all with the aim, so that's the just cause. And then the third category is proper aim. And classically understood, this is for peace. And I think a number of commentators have collapsed the two. They misunderstand that just cause and right intent are separate, and that the right intent isn't just a re-articulation of the just cause, but rather it's what are we really actually aiming to do in a teleological sense? What is the purpose of this thing called war? And in classical terms, it's always peace. It's peace first for the people that are under assault by the aggressive regime. And here we could point to the Israelis, we could point to the Americans that have been an Iranian target since 1979, international neighbors, commerce, all the rest. So it's peace in the first case for them. And then ideally peace, and this is one of the questions that Robert has that I certainly have, it ultimately ought to be peace typically with our enemies, bringing them back into sort of the fellowship of nations, but here very specifically, peace for the innocent Iranian people. And that's the part that has not dropped out, but it's not the focus, certainly, I think, for the Trump administration. I think Trump would be perfectly happy to see a regime change. But as it's been said, he said, don't grade me on this. That's not his war aim specifically. So I think we've got the three categories in place to be able to say, look, this seems to be a justified war. This particular Iranian regime has been a menace since 1979. There's just cause. There's all the rest. Maybe the real question is whether or not we can achieve these things. But in the rather limited aims that Trump elucidated on that Saturday morning, I think you could summarize it by saying he doesn't want the Iranian regime to be able to continue to be a threat to anything outside its borders. And that seems, even with what we're presently doing, at least an achievable goal, or an achievable goal at least for a number of years, after which you have to visit the thing again. So it's not ideal, but a decisive victory in terms of a total regime change and a thriving democracy in Iran doesn't seem to be this administration's war aim. And then the question, if it were, of whether or not that's achievable would certainly be a big question. And it doesn't seem to be achievable if you don't have boots on the ground.
Can I hop the cedar, Mark? Because I want to pivot this to then hear what Robert has to say. Is that okay because I want to give two prudential areas where I think Mark and I disagree. Is that?
You want to respond now?
Yes. Well, and then I want to see what Robert says, if that's all right.
Respond to Mark quickly now, then we'll go to Robert.
Okay, perfect. So I think the two prudential disagreements because I don't actually think, and I appreciate you saying this, Mark, I don't think that we have a kind of moral or theological and philosophical disagreement in terms of categories. There's two prudential things. The first of which, and this just may be my fault because I'm living up, here in Canada, getting my Canadian media. But although I also, I browse, I see other things. But part of it is that I'm just not as convinced as some of my other friends, and I think that includes Mark here, that the aims as they have been communicated out of the White House are as clear as you've represented them being. I think if I'm going to the briefings, for example, at the Pentagon, I'm feeling a lot more comfortable. But there seems to be some underlying chaos around the messaging, and that seems to me to matter pretty decisively in terms of declaring the sort of intentions. And it also seems to matter, and this is the second prudential disagreement I think that we might have. It also seems to matter that if those aims are not clearly and widely understood, not only in the administration, but also I have to say by the American public, that seems important to me, then we run the risk, and this to me is sort of, the worst case scenario, that before we have actually achieved many of the justified aims that Mark and I have both kind of laid out, there will be a premature declaration of victory because the going has gotten very difficult and the regime has proved more resilient. And so maybe the ballistic system, such as it is, though it's been degraded, is there. The nuclear material, alas, cannot be recovered because it would be a Herculean sort of project of engineering to midnight it out of the country. The Straits of Hormuz, well, maybe they'll open for a time, but now we know that the world economy can be perpetually held hostage, and there's nothing we can really do about that. And so my fear is there's actually a mismatch, not only in terms of the longevity and the necessity of this war of choice, which has now become a war of necessity, that the proper investments won't be made to actually achieve enough of those goals to the point that just war could sort of be declared. So that's sort of those are my prudential concerns. And it sounds odd just to say, as a Canadian on this call, to say my concern is that you actually won't commit enough to this war. But that is my concern, because I think now that commitments have been made, now the nuclear material must be dealt with decisively. Now the proxy terror networks must be significantly, substantially degraded. The Straits must not be a continual hostage crisis for the world's economy, or actually the situation, I fear, will be considerably worse after than it even was before.
All right, thank you, Robert. Now to Robert Nicholson with his vast expertise in the region. Robert, your thoughts on the war?
I would sum up my thoughts as this seems to be a case of doing the right thing the wrong way. And I would pick up on what my Canadian friend just was explaining, which is the war aims and the public's understanding of such. I think, I come at this from a slightly different perspective. And in my view, there are two ways to win a war. One is you destroy your enemy's capacity to fight, you break all their stuff, or you destroy their will to fight. You collapse that desire to destroy you. Now, it's actually very interesting that Americans and Israelis, by default, come at this from very different angles. Americans, we are by default keyed to collapse the enemy's will, right? Definitive, utter victory, unconditional surrender. Donald Trump said early in this war, set the bar super high. We're creating conditions for peace. The region will be stable and secure. Regimes will be changed. People will be liberated. Super high bar, right? It's the luxury of being a global superpower, as you could think in these grandiose terms. And of course, for us, World War II is the gold standard, right? Absolute good over absolute evil, unconditional surrender, no ambiguity. We won. Cold War, same thing. First Gulf War, same thing, right? Nobody doubts that we trounced the enemy. But you have these other cases, Vietnam being the archetypical example on this side, Iraq and Afghanistan also, where we are, in military terms, absolutely phenomenal. Just mop the floor with our enemies, and yet victory somehow still eludes us. And it's because we, by default, set ourselves up for these massive endeavors, the goals of which can be achieved sometimes under the right conditions, but often cannot be. The other way of winning a war, breaking your enemy's capacity to fight, smashing all their missiles and guns and all that, it's less sexy, but it's actually much more normal. And by the way, Israelis fight this way by default. Israelis have no expectation of reshaping the region, right? Ending war for all times, and everybody's going to accept them as part of the Middle East, like because they're Jewish and the state of Israel inherits the Jewish collective memory. They go into wars assuming that this is not going to really do anything in the long term, right? In terms of Israeli military doctrine, is actually a term in Hebrew. It's kind of well known by now, kisuach hadeshet, which is you mow the grass.
Mhm.
And you're going to have to go back probably in a few more years and mow it again, but whatever, that's the world we live in. So Benjamin Netanyahu has a much easier time at the end of this war than Donald Trump, turning to his people and saying, here's a list of stuff we smashed. The Iranians, the regime may still be in place. The country may still hate us, but for now, we're actually pretty good. And, although this is an American-Israeli war, we're actually seeing it through two totally different lenses.
Hmm.
And the ambiguity that Robert Joustra just mentioned is, I think, to me, very worrying because it's setting ourselves up yet again for this frustration and despondency at feeling like we didn't accomplish something when actually, in fact, if you look at what we've been doing, we've actually accomplished quite a bit. And so I think it's just a great example of how perception influences how these things are done. And in this particular case, how the failure to craft the right narrative and explain the telos to the American people at the outset is already creating and may create even more a snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I think it's perfectly acceptable, or we should be able to find it perfectly acceptable that sometimes wars are limited, they don't lead to peace, they don't do anything grand, they just set the enemy back for a little while. We're not ready for that. No one's trained us for that. No one's speaking to us in those terms. And so we feel like we're losing when we're actually not. That's what's concerning to me about this war.
Robert, what is your guess as to when Israel feels the time is right to end it?
Well, it's interesting that Israel has shown in material terms a desire to change this regime in rhetorical and material terms, right? They are going further than they usually would go in these cases. And it does square with some evolution of Israeli military doctrine since October 7th. They've been a little more expansive than they've been in the past. But by and large, if Donald Trump decides to end the war today, and it will be Donald Trump who ends it, I think all Israelis understand that implicitly. If Trump pulls out, Israel's not going to probably continue fighting, at least in an overt sense, beyond that. I think if Donald Trump today says this war is over, Benjamin Netanyahu can turn to his people and with some amount of confidence say, we did a lot, and Iran, the regime has taken a major blow. And it's true the regime is still in place and the people are still oppressed. And they're going to probably start trying to dig out those 400 kilograms of enriched uranium. But hey, we got a little window here. Maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's five, but we did something. That would be an acceptable outcome for the vast majority of Israelis. So it's it's less a question of like what's the ultimate box that needs to be checked and just making sure that as much damage was done to that capability, to the capacity to fight as possible.
So for Israel, it's pretty much a win no matter what happens in terms of Iran being degraded compared to where it was a few weeks ago.
I think for Bibi's legacy, he would love to see something grander, despite everything I just said, right? He is, calling on the Iranian people with these videos to celebrate their ancient, pre-Islamic festivals, and he's trying to take out, top leadership, people who are heading the Basij, internal repression militia. These are all signs that Bibi would like to see a new regime in place. I mean, how nice would it be for him to ride off into the sunset with Israel and Iran at peace, right, after all of these years of struggle? But I don't think it's necessary.
Marc LiVecche, your thoughts and responses to Robert Nicholson and Robert Joustra.
Yeah, regarding Nicholson, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that is what I kind of tried to say, and I think in Joustra and I's conversation a few weeks ago, I used the phrase, I wasn't able to quote it in Hebrew, but mow the lawn, and that seems, and the responses that I've gotten from that comment are largely negative, right? And it's probably owing to the American desire for real systemic strategic level change. But the other way to phrase what Nicholson said, there's two ways to end a war: you destroy your enemy's capacity or their will to fight, or ideally both, right? So it's not an either or. Netanyahu, presumably would have no trouble with a regime change in a liberal society in Persia. That'd be grand, right? Who wouldn't want that? But I think Nicholson is right that the conditions that will allow that to be possible are largely probably not external. And so it is going to be up to the Iranian people or some combination of, an escalation and then the will of the Iranian people, etc. I think there's still hope. I'm still holding out. I think there are numerous paths forward, conceivable paths forward that aren't just pie in the sky. It'll probably result in something like a civil war that's not, completely factional, but something like the national army, and then, the population behind it, against the IRGC or something. And I could see ways forward where that could happen. But I think the Israeli mindset is just more sober and more, just more sober. I think the crisis for us, the one thing that I would love Nicholson to respond to is it seems that however different Israeli governments are, there's a basic symmetry maybe in how they approach external enemies. Whereas in America, and maybe this blends a little bit of what both Roberts have said, in America, we've kicked this thing off. And maybe under the Trump administration, the idea that we might have to mow the lawn down the road, but that is still a win because their capacity to hurt anybody on the outside has been diminished, and then we'll just mow it back when it increases again. That's largely dependent on American administrations, future American administrations agreeing with that. And now Iran knows that they are in a different spot. And I imagine, that they know, we are one crisis away from non-existence in terms of being a regime. And so any future American administration had better be willing to mow the lawn. Otherwise, it seems, we will be in a far worse place. And so that's my concern with not doing the whole thing. And I'm not saying, therefore, the Trump administration should attempt the whole thing. But what does the future hold for American will?
Robert Joustra, any comments?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I mean, I think it kind of sort of gets to part of what I was arguing for as well, which is, there is a way, and I may be, it's funny that I may be more pessimistic than Mark here, but there is a way in which actually, especially if there is a premature conclusion to this war before the mowing has been sufficiently achieved, to borrow the metaphor. There is a world in which actually, what civil conflict does emerge or what proxies sort of, flourish as the result of that, and the instabilities in the region actually create not only considerably worse results by way of justice, but also considerably worse results by way of national security. And of course, these things aren't separable. That's my concern, and it sort of relates to what Robert was saying as well, which is the ability to explain this to the American public. One fears sometimes you hear that it's just kind of, it's just calm spin. But I don't think this is just comms. I mean, there has to be a kind of argument that has been broadly accepted or is broadly engaged on the part of the American people who are its future government, who say, yes, this is something that we can commit to iteratively. My fear is that if the war is ended prematurely and then it polls so terribly that Americans, sort of assume we should never do anything like this again. It was a political disaster, like us here in Canada changing our constitution. We badly need to do it, but it was such a disaster 20 years ago. Nobody will ever attempt it ever again. That actually what you end up with is a situation that isn't finished. And so significantly more instability, more injustice, more insecurity, and actually an evaporation of capacity and will on the part of the American people to pick it up down the road. To me, that's actually a much worse scenario. And I have to say, it doesn't seem entirely unlikely to me. These are the prudential judgments that I think we're debating. That does not seem entirely unlikely as a future scenario.
Yeah, if I can just pile on here, I think there's actually a larger point that I can't, avoid, and I would hope that the American people can't avoid, which is that, not for nothing, this pivot to Asia, it's not coming, right? We're not leaving the Middle East. The fact that this regime, which is on the ropes like no other regime, is able, with mere threats, not even physically closing the Straits of Hormuz, just threatening to damage anything going through the Straits of Hormuz, is able to do what it's doing to the global economy, to me proves that our engagement in this part of the world, it's not about Israel and them getting us to get involved in all of that. It is because this region is the pivot of pivots, right? It is the geographical and to some extent ideological, you know, convergence point, right? There's just it's a choke point filled with choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is just one of them. You could talk about Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, and so many others. Like all the energy resources, all of the world's major religions touching in this place. Like we're here to stay, and if we're not, we're irrelevant, right? And if you want to do anything in East Asia, you have to be engaged here because if China is the one who has control of this whole situation, after we do what Robert Joustra just said, and after this say, you know what, that's the last thing of those we're doing, then like we might as well just hand in our superpower membership card right there. So to me, there's a larger task here of not just creating the narrative to explain this war, but to kind of break it to the American people. Listen, it's not the Jews that are keeping us here. This region is objectively important. It has the ability to turn the world upside down. And if we are not forward deployed and making sure that something like this doesn't happen again, mowing the grass or doing whatever else needs to be done, we have much bigger problems, actually.
Picking up on that point, as I was discussing with Robert Joustra before we began, this is across 80 years, to my knowledge, the first major U.S. military action that didn't begin with majority U.S. support, which seems pretty remarkable because almost always there's been a instinct by the American people to support a president during an initial military action. It doesn't seem to, the support now doesn't seem to go any higher than 40%, perhaps because of a lack of more public explanation, perhaps because of our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. But clearly, the American people dating back to 1979 have a justifiably very negative view of the Iranian regime. So, how do you all explain this low level of American support for the war? And is that a problem in waging the war?
I had an interesting conversation at church on Sunday with a guy who I've known for a long time and grew up in like a just think of like conservative, evangelical, pro-Israel household, like all of that. Deeply disturbed by this war, actually asking me like, so by the way, do you think Israel was behind the Charlie Kirk assassination and the Epstein fight, like the full blown, the whole hog. And I don't think he's unrepresentative. I think people don't know what we're doing. People still feel, I just was looking at poll numbers yesterday, that by and large, America's a force for good. They're proud of who we are. They worry about our global standing, but no one's really made it clear to them what all of this stuff is for. And I don't want to make me so reductionist to make everything about, public narratives and all of that. But I think the American people after the Iraq War um, are struggling with a sense of purpose that informs lots of other things downstream, right? What happened in the Iraq War and Afghanistan? We had this big universal mission that we would have been very proud of, that had been vindicated after the Cold War, that ran up against the fact that actually this vision isn't as universal as we thought it was. There are large numbers of people on this planet that don't want the thing that we're selling. Like which we think we're liberating them, they think we're colonizing them. And it was like a major cognitive dissonance that I think undermined the whole concept of American foreign policy.
Hmm.
So we kind of swung the pendulum the other way. It was like, all right, so we're not going to really do anything around the world. We'll do what we got to do for us. Then okay, we'll do some things for allies where it works for us. But beyond that, like, you guys can live in your cesspool of oppression. Like we don't care. You don't want it. We don't have to give it to you. And I think that people don't articulate it that way. But I could name, 20 other people that I know who would kind of say things in that vein. And so you present them with another Middle Eastern war, that if you're not the kind of person, like us who are maybe following these things closely, seems to just drop out of a clear blue sky. No, of course you're not supporting it. And even if you voted for Donald Trump, you're thinking like, didn't he promise me that he would never ever do this kind of thing again? What gives? Is this just an Epstein distraction? And that's when people go off in that direction.
Mm.
That's a little rambly, but that's kind of how I see it.
Mark and Robert, Joustra, final thoughts?
Go ahead, Robert.
Oh, well, so first off, I think conspiracy fills a vacuum, right? So people come up with very creative and conspiratorial explanations for facts when they're not given kind of one coherent sort of argument forward. And this administration has, not been entirely on message on a range of different issues, and so the conspiracies. They flourish. In addition to that, I think the administration periodically makes pretextual arguments. About why it is they want to do things. Now I'm going to say this as a Canadian sitting in Canada, who, by the way, thinks that the United States has legitimate trade grievances with us. I just don't happen to think that those grievances extend to the massive amounts of fentanyl that are coming across the border as exercised around international emergency measures. There were boats blown up, coming out of Venezuela. What were they? What were they for? What was happening there? I think, as I say, for people who aren't following it quite as closely as we are, I think there's kind of a gap in information. They don't entirely understand both why are you doing this, and when you tell me you're doing it for this reason, we can plainly see that it's not really about this reason, the drugs coming from Venezuela or whatever. Again, most of them go to Europe. So there's some other pretextual reason for which some of these things are happening. It becomes difficult to trust, conspiracy takes root, and now here, and finally, I think it's important to note, not only do the American people, I think, not know what to think about this, they don't trust it. They're kind of filling the empty air or the dissonant sort of points with conspiracy and conversation. But I think also America's longtime international allies don't know, some of whom are actually still kind of aggrieved about things that were sort of said either accidentally or off the cuff or otherwise. I mean, the British are still talking about the fact that the president talked about their troops serving, quote, a little bit back from the front lines and not really being there in Afghanistan. They're still talking about that. Canada's still talking about the 51st state. Denmark's still talking about Greenland. I mean, there are a lot of these different sort of recreational pressures that this administration has put on its allies, despite which, by the way, and I was somewhat surprised to see my own Prime Minister Carney come out more or less in support, actually, of American action straight out of the gate on the weekend after Iran, saying, you know what, this is a terrible regime and it's getting what's coming to it. And a lot of these objectives are completely noteworthy and important, although he's backpedaled a little bit since then. The other European nations, not at all. And so I think part of it is not only, explaining to your own people, but also your allies, some of whom were then belatedly called on to fulfill a role in the Straits of Hormuz by way of providing security. And I think a lot of them just don't know what to think. And in the absence of which, sometimes the worst case assumptions and deep-rooted conspiracy takes place. And I think that puts the likelihood of success as a category of just war into a dangerous place, because it means that you don't have the trust which you need in order to execute long-term acts of justice and humanitarian intervention like this. And I'm not sure that America has those reservoirs right now. And yeah, admittedly, that makes me pretty pessimistic about this as a just war.
Marc LiVecche?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is I have long longed for the day when American politicians feel that they can trust the American people well enough to tell us everything that they ought to want us to know about what it is they're doing and how it fits into larger strategic initiatives. I think there is a link to the pivot to China in what we're doing in Iran right now. I think a case could be made that all of this is of a type, from Venezuela forward, one could see, kind of plans within plans. And I think a case could be made. I think Americans need to, I mean, they've touched on the perfect series of storms that have come together to, I think, collude in part to the low support for this war, things that are legitimate and illegitimate. And I think a case could be made to push against that. At the very least, I hope a case can be made that this regime, which has been an ongoing and perennial menace for, all of my life, or not all of my life, nearly all of my life, deserves what it gets, and that reducing its ability to harm those beyond its borders, and ideally destroying its ability to harm those within its borders is simply a good. And then other things would have to fall in line beyond that. But yeah, that's all I've got.
Robert
I'm
Nicholson,
curious.
two final thoughts.
Well, I'm curious what you guys think about the possibility that Trump could be seen as victorious by pulling the plug, in the near future, and what conditions would be necessary for that perception to be felt. Whether it's, I don't know, it's taking Harg Island or the enriched uranium. I mean, is my sense is that he's not going to want to do this for months, right? Which to do it right may be needed, and that he probably will find some off ramp, pretextual or not. And I'm just curious, this is like a question I'm asking myself, like, could that work, do you think? Would that be a worse outcome? Would people perceive it as worse, or would they just be relieved that it's over?
Well, I mean, we know that half of the United States, it won't move the bubble for them at all. So the other half that is willing to, potentially countenance the idea, it'll be in messaging. I think the other Robert is right. There has to be a clear sense of something against which the American people can measure the effort. And if that's unclear in people's minds, then it needs to be made clear. And I think it's been made clear, but in various ways. But maybe you have to do a lot more work in order to see what the proclaimed ends are. So make that message very clear, and then peg the effort to that aim, and make the case for why something that looks limited and does not free the Iranian people, if that's the result, is nevertheless worth the lift, and why it puts things in a better place, measurably, than where we started.
Marc LiVecche, Robert Joustra, Robert Nichols, thank you very much for a very informative and enlightening conversation on the Iran war. We'll have to reconvene in a couple weeks to compare notes and see where we are. Until then, thanks again.
We'll have to reconvene after the Mew gets there.
Is this going to be a big